Thanks for joining us again with interviews with Dr. Eli. Today, we are with the esteemed Tamara Pincus, who is a therapist in the Washington, D.C. area who specializes in sex and gender minorities, and especially people in consensually monogamous, non-monogamous, or monogamous too, but mostly consensually non-monogamous relationships. Welcome, Tamara.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I'm thrilled to chat with you. Could you tell us a little bit about your training and your background?
So I have a master's in clinical social work from Catholic University, not a good fit, and I'm an ASEX certified sex therapist. I did most of those trainings sort of ad hoc at various conferences around the country with lots of different people. So that was a really fun process and sort of kept going with that. Now I have a small group private practice. So I have 4 other therapists who work for me, all who are working on sex therapy certification, and all of us specialize in working with non-monogamy and kink and LGBTQ populations.
And how long have you been practicing?
So I have had my private practice for 9 years. So quite a while. And then I became a group practice about 3 years ago.
Excellent. And I know you've written a book about coming out as polyamorous. Can you tell me what spurred that book? Like, why'd you write that book?
Well, I noticed that a lot of the people that I was coming across in my practice and also in my life were poly, were in the process of coming out, and there just weren't any resources out there for them. And it was one of those questions that came up pretty much every month in my poly discussion group, like, how do you come out to this group? How do you come out to that group? So now there's a book. You can read about it.
And what's that book called?
It's called Polyamory, Coming Out About Your Non-Monogamous Relationships.
And where can people find that book?
They can find it on Amazon or wherever books are sold.
Excellent. And when people talk to you about coming out, what are some of the issues they bring up?
I think some of the major concerns are around just feeling judged by the community in various ways, losing relationships with family. People are very worried about child custody for obvious reasons. A lot of people are worried about their job situations. So a lot of people fear that if they were to be outed at work, they would get fired. And that's often true, particularly in the military where infidelity is like a punishable crime.
Absolutely. Those concerns are valid.
Mm-hmm.
No, with polyamory, there's definitely no one size fits all when it comes to anything, really. But of what are the wrong ways to come out that you've talked to people about, the tips to avoid?
I think something to avoid is to come out at a big family holiday. Not that we're doing those anymore, but you don't have to worry about that. We're not going to have 15 people in a room. But I think that it can sort of shift the focus onto you, particularly if it's a holiday or if it's an event that's celebrating someone. Don't come out at your sister's wedding. I think if you are worried that somebody is going to have a really extreme reaction, it makes a lot of sense to come out in writing and give them some time to really think through what their response is before they get back to you. Because I think if you're going to have somebody who's going to have an extreme reaction and you're going to be in the same physical space, sometimes that can lead to screaming and violence, and you don't want to have to face that.
So that's a tip about how to come out appropriately. Do you have any other tips about kind of smart ways to come out? Obviously, avoid coming out at your sister's wedding or your, nephew's bar mitzvah.
Right. I think it's really helpful to sort of think through who is safe to come out to and why. I think it helps to sort of think through what their concerns are going to be. People often will get really worried about you when they hear that you're polyamorous and think, oh no, this person is being taken advantage of, like their partner is just being terrible to them, and why would they put up with this? So I think that you have to really be in a place to be able to answer some of those concerns. I think when you're just starting out in polyamory and you're not sure if it's right for you, it can be really tough if you come out to people who are going to be like, what are you doing? I think sometimes that sort of pushes people back the other way. It helps to choose to come out to people who can be supportive, and also to find community resources for yourself, to find your local poly groups, and or meetups on Zoom, whatever it is you can do, to sort of find some supports for yourself. Because I think if you try to get your monogamous friends to be the ones to support you through the transition to polyamory, if that's a transition that you're going through, they don't know what you're talking about, and they often come with a lot of judgment and a lot of concerns that are sometimes out of line, or sometimes just based on erroneous views of partnership and sexuality.
You said it's a good idea to look for polyamorous groups and things like that. Where should people look? Like, where can they find those resources?
The internet, that's vague. So I have a poly discussion group that I run, that's listed on meetup.com. A lot of different localities have poly groups that are on Meetup. Also, sometimes on FetLife you can find poly groups. That's all I can think of offhand, though I'm sure there are other ways.
Those are great resources, I think, especially if people are not necessarily familiar with them. Just as a note, there's a super significant, not for you, Tamara, because you know this already, but for people watching the video, there's really significant overlap between people who enjoy kinky sex and people who are polyamorous. So FetLife is a website for people who are into BDSM or want to explore kinky sex or want to find people to have kinky sex with. And you don't necessarily have to be kinky to find interesting things to read and acceptance there. It's FET, F-E-T, FetLife.com or .org?
It's .com.
It is
.com. It's definitely not an org.
Okay. How about coming out at work? Do you have any either cautionary tales or suggestions of what to do or not to do around coming out at work?
I mean, I think you have to be really careful about where your work environment is. I think sometimes it's helpful to sort of feel it out, like talk about polyamory in like a vague way that's not necessarily about you, and see how people react, to sort of test the waters to see if it might be a safe place for you to come out or not. I think that you don't necessarily need to make it a big deal. You don't have to be like, sit down with somebody and be like, let me tell you that I'm polyamorous. But I think that the thing that is nice is when you're working with people is like, when people ask you a question, like, what did you do over the weekend? To just tell the truth, to just be like, I spent some time with a partner, and then I spent some time with another partner, or, me and both my partners went to the such and such place, or to just be able to be yourself. Because I think that's the really hard thing about being closeted, is just having to hold back so much about who you really are.
I wonder if you could tell us some of the costs of being closeted.
I mean, I think being closeted can be really hard on your mental health. You can feel very isolated and alone. And it can feel like the only people that you can talk to are your partners. And that can put a lot of just extra burden on those relationships.
Absolutely. And I wonder I've been thinking a lot about kind of this imperative that we've had since the HIV epidemic, that any sex and gender minority should always come out, and it's kind of a political duty in a way to come out. And I think that, at least for me, that strikes me as a very white perspective. Like, there's one way to be out, and it's the only way to do it is to broadcast it on blast to everyone. Under what conditions is it okay not to come out? Or, what, I don't know, I guess, what do you think about that?
I mean, I think you're right it is, you have to be in a position of privilege to be able to come out and keep your job and keep your child custody and keep all the things that you have. And I think a lot of people can't make that choice, and that's okay. And that we need to support them. I think that because there are not employment protections, housing protections, those kinds of things for poly people, it does make it much more dangerous for poly people to come out than for some of the other minorities at this point. But also, I feel like our country is just slipping so far as even trying to be not racist or trying to, like I don't, it's a really unsafe time to be different. And I could see why people would make the choice to not tell people. I also think that, like, for a lot of us who are at home and not interacting with people, like, it's different than it was a year ago. Like, I wrote a book on this, like, before the quarantine, and I feel like now everything is different, and I haven't entirely thought through, like, how coming out issues work in this kind of environment where you're not even seeing people.
When would you say it's important to come out?
I think it's important to come out when it feels like not coming out is hurting you, when you feel not seen, and that is becoming so problematic for you that it's making you feel really bad. I also think that that sometimes when you have a partner who is not able to be out, like, there's just a lot of stress around that. Like, I have a partner who's not really able to acknowledge me anywhere near his work life because he would probably lose his job. And I think it's really hard. Like, and I, like, parts of me desperately want him to come out, but also, like, you know, similarly to what we were saying before about, you know, coming out being a really white thing, like, he's a person of color, like, people already see him as a bit of a rabble rouser, even though he's totally not. Like, it's just not safe. So I'm not sure I answered your question, because I'm not sure I said when people should come out. I feel like people should come out when they feel safe enough to come out, and when it feels important to them to come out. I think for a lot of us, polyamory is not just about our relationships, but is about our personal identity. And so sometimes if we don't come out, we don't feel like people really know us or see us.
You bring up a really good point about, I mean, people in polyamorous relationships, there's often multiple people. So what happens if one person wants to be out, but other people don't want to be out? Like, how do people manage not outing each other, but still being true to themselves?
I mean, I think it can be really hard, because I think if you're, like, in a public place with a partner who's not out, like, sometimes that means you can't touch that partner, or you can't talk to that partner in the same way you usually would. So I think people have to make pretty careful negotiations around how they're going to behave in public when that's the situation. And also how they talk on social media, so they don't accidentally out anybody. I do think that there's a risk when you're not out of people seeing you somewhere and thinking that if you're with another partner, thinking that, like, you're cheating on someone. And so I think that that can make situations really difficult. I think particularly when people are not out to their children, and children are pretty perceptive, like, they tend to know if you're in a romantic relationship with somebody. So or if you're out of the house, like, 3 nights a week, like, they're going to know that something's going on. So I think it's important to be out in those situations, just particularly so kids don't feel like they have to, like, lie for their parents.
Would you suggest coming out to kids?
I mean, I think you have to pay attention to what's age appropriate for the child. You don't necessarily need to be like, we are polyamorous. Like, you could just say, like, this is another person that I love, and, you know, your mom or dad knows about that, and they're okay, and we're not doing anything wrong. I think you have to be careful what you say, because kids are going to repeat what you say. They're not necessarily, younger kids are not able to hold secrets. So it's really important that, like, they don't know anything that's going to, like, if they tell grandma, terrible things are going to happen. I think with older kids, you just, you know, talk about your life as it goes along. Like, again, I don't necessarily think you need to, like, have a family meeting and sit down and be like, mom and dad are polyamorous. Like, I think, like, you know, Fred is going to be over Tuesday night, and your kids are going to notice if you and Fred are cuddling, right? So
Is it okay to cuddle in front of the kids with your other partners?
I don't see any reason it would be different to cuddle with your other partners than it would be to cuddle with, their other parent or whatever. Like, I feel like cuddling is okay. Like, I feel like poly people should have the same boundaries around sexual behavior that other people have. I think they generally do.
I absolutely agree with,
Mm-hmm.
and it's been weird in some of the custody cases I've worked on that, the ex-spouse puts a requirement on the custody that the kids are not to know about this. And that always rubs me the wrong way. Like, it's good for kids to see people being loving to each other. And there's
Mm-hmm.
a huge gap between treating each other with love and respect and affection and being sexual. And most people know just almost instinctively, like, where that line is. And to have it be the same exact line, affection equals sex, for people in polyamorous relationships and custody disputes, just rubs me the wrong way.
Well, and it's such a bad message for children to have, that affection equals sex, because that means that they think that any other kid that hugs them should be open to sex, or like that, like, as they get older, their ideas about consent and what sexuality looks like get really messed up. And so I think it's really important to sort of start young, talk about consent, talk about different kinds of touch and those different meanings, and not to just have like anything where anybody touches you is a sex thing. And also, I'm never going to touch my kid again because Lord forbid they interpret that as a sexual thing. I think that's so
Right.
bad for children.
Agreed.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have anything else to say about coming out as a polyamorous person? Any other questions I haven't asked you?
Um, I guess I'm just going to be a long, awkward silence. I mean, I think there's a lot of other situations that we haven't really touched on. Like, I feel like it's like coming out in religious communities, for instance, it is like a whole other bag of worms. And do worms come in bags? I don't know. But like, I just think that like, I think there's a whole concern about like losing your community, losing the people that you really attached to. And I think there are some places that are more open and some places that are less. I think that as polyamory becomes more visible, it will be easier for people to come out. But I do think that right now, like in some more conservative spaces, it's just, you're going to lose everybody around you.
Do you have any recommendations for coming out in religious spaces?
So I'm not religious, so I don't know a lot about that. Somebody actually asked me this last night in my group. I think it would be helpful to find some of the poly people who are religious. I believe um, Reverend Beverly Dale might be a good resource for people who are interested in trying to sort of reconcile, particularly if they're Christian, sort of Christian religion and polyamory, and how to talk about it in a way that doesn't cause problems. And I do think that like some areas of Christianity are more open than others. I mean, similar with Jews, like more conservative Jews are less open to this kind of stuff.
I know that the Unitarian Universalists, if people are looking for a spiritual space that is pretty accepting of polyamory, the UUs have a long history of supporting polyamorous relationships, and even have a subcommittee about, like, the UU Poly Committee. I'm not really sure what it's called.
Yeah, absolutely. That's true. I think one of the other things that's interesting to think about is about coming out around school, like particularly children in poly families. I know my sons are both starting school again, but my older one who's in high school is getting a lot of this, like, make a slideshow telling us about your family. And so he's been avoiding talking about the fact that he's from a poly family because it's dangerous, which I think makes sense. last year, before all the craziness, I went to a meeting to talk about the sex ed program. And I talked about how the curriculum was very mononormative. It basically said you should only ever have sex in a married monogamous relationship. And I was like, well, that's a really hurtful message for my kid to get at school, that like their family is wrong and broken according to the school system. And one of the teachers in this space was basically like, well, you're immoral, so
oh no.
like she had all the judgment. So I can see why he doesn't want to be out at school. I think there have been other situations where we've like, when all of the kids, like my 2 kids and my husband's girlfriend's daughter, were all in elementary school at the same time, and sometimes like go to school events with the 3 of us, and nobody like said anything or was problematic in that way. But somehow as they've gotten older, I feel like that judgment is showing up more in weird ways.
Kid, so how did you talk about that, or how did you handle that afterwards with your kid?
Yeah, I talked to my son about what happened, and he has been sort of impressed with my attempts to try to stand up to the school board around the sex ed curriculum, but also like it hasn't really changed anything, nor is it likely to. And he doesn't want to be responsible for carrying that message into the classrooms. Like he doesn't want to have to be the voice, and I think that's fair. So like he's happy for me to talk to the people in positions of power, but he's not gonna do anything. That's fine. He's young. He ends up doing a lot of like sort of taking care of other kids who have gender issues or sexuality issues anyway, because they just like, he's really open, and he seems to find a lot of non-binary kids to be friends with who need somebody to talk about it with.
So that's great, subverting the school system's sex negativity from the inside.
Indeed.
Being a source for each other.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I always like to ask at the end if there was one thing you could tell counselors and therapists who want to be good at serving people in diverse, consensually non-monogamous relationships. What is that one thing that's super important for them to know?
So I think the thing that I've found in therapy with the wrong therapists, and that I've had a lot of clients experience, is that their therapists are coming in with this judgment of people can really only love one person at a time. So if this is happening, something is really wrong. And that person that you're with that's also with somebody else doesn't really love you. So I think it's really important for therapists to know that, like, even though it might not be their experience, even though they may have never been in love with more than one person, that it is real for other people, and that if they tell their client that they're not loved, that is harmful.
Agreed. Well, thank you so much for your time. If people want more information about you or your practice, where would they find that information?
So my website, tamarapincus.com, is the place to go for that.
And how do you spell Pincus?
Pincus.
So TAMARAPINCUS.com.
That's correct. Thank you.
Awesome.